chamber pulsed like a ticking bomb. This wasn't just another policy debate. This was war over the soul of America's budget. Congress had called a special session to confront the firestorm surrounding the sudden, sweeping cuts to environmental funding. Cuts that had already shuttered air monitoring stations, paused clean water projects, and endangered vulnerable communities. Cameras flashed. Live streams surged past 10 million viewers. Into the room stormed Zeldin, eyes cold, folder thick with charts and accusations. He didn't come to answer questions. He came to end the so-called green slush fund and anyone defending it. He took his seat like a prosecutor, not a congressman, jaw locked, ready to strike. Across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett sat still, but every inch of her was coiled like a storm. No entourage, no fanfare. Just her notepad, a highlighter, and one photo taped inside. A sick child from Houston whose school air filter was shut down when the budget vanished. She wasn't here for headlines. She was here for justice. Zeldin had the data. She had the damage. And in that moment, under the blinding lights of national broadcast, the real battle began. Not over money, but over what kind of country America dared to be. Emotions crackled in the air like static. Then Zeldin leaned into his mic, and the first blow landed. "Let me be perfectly clear," he said, voice clipped, rising with the rhythm of practiced fury. "I terminated a fraud. I ended the mass burning of taxpayer dollars under the false banner of saving the planet." The words cut through the tension like a blade. No clearing of the throat, no polite preamble, just an execution of pleasantries and a direct strike to the heart of the hearing. Every camera in the room adjusted its focus. Every phone in the gallery stopped scrolling. There was no mistaking the tone in Zeldin's voice. It wasn't simply righteous, it was surgical. He wasn't trying to persuade, he was here to prosecute. Behind him, an aide tapped the keyboard, and the massive screen flickered to life. It displayed the first slide. Black title, red font, and rows of numbers highlighted like warning lights. Zeldin didn't even turn to look. He already knew what was coming. He'd rehearsed this moment with the precision of a sniper setting his scope. And now he was ready to pull the trigger. The slide was labeled Environmental Grant Allocations, Fiscal Year 2022 to 2023. Below it, an ocean of figures, green for grants issued, yellow for those in process, and red, bold, flashing red, for every project marked incomplete, non-reporting, or flagged. One column stood out, $2.1 million allocated for a solar job training center in New Mexico. Zeldin moved his finger slowly over the figure, as if dragging a scalpel across skin. "This," he said, his voice unwavering, "is what your so-called green justice looks like. $2.1 million for a solar training center that never trained a single worker. Not one. The building's foundation wasn't even poured." He didn't blink, didn't smile. He just moved to the next item. $850,000, he continued, for a compost startup in Ohio. The company was run out of a single-family home. Its founder, the nephew of a state delegate who campaigned on green equity. No product, no output, no accountability. The screen changed again, this time to a wire transfer log. $5 million, Zeldin said, letting the words drag for effect, was wired for a project called Community Air Tracking. Sounds good, right? Except there isn't a single working sensor. Not one. The contractor went bankrupt. The money vanished. No explanation, no audit. He paused, letting the silence linger like smoke after an explosion. The committee room was dead quiet. No shuffling papers, no shifting in chairs. Even the photographer stopped clicking. Zeldin leaned back slightly, both hands resting on the desk in front of him. "These aren't investments," he said, almost whispering now. "They're favors. They're vote-buying machines disguised as environmental programs, handshakes cloaked in sustainability. And the EPA?" He narrowed his eyes. "Complicit, rubber stamping these grants like it's monopoly money, granting access to insiders. No metrics, no audits, no consequences." For a brief second, you could hear a distant cough from the press section. Otherwise, the silence was absolute. His next words struck like a hammer. "And now I'm the villain? For saying enough is enough?" He turned his whole body toward the panel now, addressing not just the elected officials, but the audience, the cameras, the nation itself. You want transparency? You're about to get scorched with it. Across the room, Jasmine Crockett hadn't moved once. She sat as she had before, spine straight, chin slightly lifted, one elbow resting softly on her legal pad. No reactions, no rebuttals, only her eyes, sharp, unwavering, trained directly on Zeldin. Not in shock, not in defiance, in something far more dangerous. Preparation. Because while Zeldin had spent the last 10 minutes lighting up spreadsheets, Jasmine Crockett had been staring through them, at the people those dollars were meant to serve. The children in Houston whose schools now smelled of mold. The mothers in Michigan who boiled water because the filtration projects had been halted mid-phase. The workers in the Bronx whose asthma clinics were shuttered when the grant expired before the equipment arrived. Zeldin had the receipts. Crockett had the aftermath. And she knew there is a difference between waste and war. And this was about to be both. Now, as the smoke from Zeldin's barrage still hung in the air, the room didn't shift because someone spoke, but because Jasmine Crockett finally stood. The leather chair creaked faintly as she pushed back, but she didn't rush. There was no dramatic flourish, no stack of papers slammed on the desk. Only presence, measured, restrained, undeniable. She stood with the quiet certainty of someone who didn't need to posture to command the room. Her gaze never left Zeldin, not for a second, not even when a camera swung to capture her profile or when aides whispered nervously behind the committee bench. Jasmine Crockett didn't move like a politician. She moved like a witness, like someone who had walked through the aftermath of policies made in rooms like this and buried in Excel sheets like the ones Zeldin had just displayed. She placed both palms gently on the wooden desk before her, fingers splayed, breathing steady. Then came the words, "You cut the funding," she said, her voice low, controlled, but razor sharp. "I come from the place that used to live on it." It didn't come with rage. It came with precision and the weight of 1,000 stories pressing down on every syllable. The room shifted, not outwardly, but internally. You could feel it. Elected officials who'd sat with arms crossed began to uncross them. A reporter in the back lowered his phone mid-recording. This wasn't soundbite politics. This was testimony. She continued, and the tone changed, not louder, but deeper. She didn't need slides or charts. Her evidence was stored in memory. "I come from a community where kids don't run outside after school because the air burns when they breathe, where families boil brown tap water while watching TV commercials about progress, where we teach children not to play near storm drains because the runoff stings their skin." Crockett paused, eyes narrowing slightly. Not in anger, but in resolve. "You talk about audits. Let me give you one. A 7-year-old in South Dallas collapsed on the school track field because the air monitors hadn't been serviced in 8 months. A housing project in Baton Rouge still has black mold growing through the vents because the grant meant to clean it up was frozen in committee." Her hand reached slowly into a manila folder, and what she pulled out wasn't data. It was a photo. Wrinkled, folded at the corner, she lifted it for the panel to see. A little girl, standing outside a red brick building with peeling paint, an oxygen tank strapped to her side. "She didn't ask for politics," Jasmine said, her voice tight now. "She asked for air." The silence that followed wasn't passive. It was paralyzing. The kind of silence that thickens into shame, that forces you to stare inward. No one reached for their mic. No one tried to rebut. Because at that moment, Zeldin's graphs, however damning, felt small. "You keep calling it fraud," she said. "Where I'm from, we call it survival. And when you tore the lifeline from us, you didn't just cut waste. You cut breathing." Her hand lowered the photo, slowly, respectfully. She didn't look down at it. She already knew that face by heart. Jasmine took one small step back from the mic and let the silence speak. And it did. Loudly, uncomfortably. Because in a chamber designed for noise and power, she had weaponized quiet, and it hit harder than anything data ever could. And then, without raising her voice, without breaking the silence she had just weaponized, Jasmine Crockett turned her screen toward the room and began the slow, surgical unraveling of Lee Zeldin's narrative. No dramatics, no anger, just facts, each one sharper than any line Zeldin had thrown. The first image filled the screen behind her, an aerial photo of a small town in Louisiana. The streets flooded not from storm surge, but from a broken water system left unrepaired. Jasmine's voice cut through the quiet like steel. "This," she said, "is St. Bernard Parish. 3,000 families lost access to clean water when their filtration center was forced to shut down. The project to modernize it was fully funded, until your cuts pulled the plug. The pumps failed 2 weeks later." She paused. "Some of them are still bathing with bottled water." Before the panel could react, she clicked again. A map of the Bronx appeared, shaded in toxic orange. "This," she continued, "is PS 145 and the 5-block radius around it, home to 400 children, all diagnosed with moderate to severe asthma. The air quality station meant to monitor pollutants here was decommissioned 3 months ago. No backup, no notice, just silence." She took one breath. 2 kids were hospitalized during recess last week. Their parents didn't even know the monitors were gone. There were no gasps, but something heavier, guilt maybe or shame, rippled across the panel. A Republican from Utah shifted in his chair. The senator from Arizona leaned forward, squinting at the screen like seeing the truth for the first time. Jasmine said nothing. She didn't press the moment. She simply clicked again. Now a drone shot of Florida's Gulf Coast. Flooded neighborhoods, mangled trees, rooftops torn open like tin. She spoke calmly, too calmly. The Mangrove Restoration Program in Collier County wasn't just a climate initiative. It was flood defense. These trees were the first line of protection for over 10,000 residents during hurricane season. The program was suspended. You know why? She looked directly at Zeldin, unwavering. A Category 2 storm hit 2 months later. The water breached everything. Zeldin remained stone-faced, but his jaw had tightened. His hand, once resting casually on the desk, now curled slowly into a fist. He said nothing. Not yet. Crockett clicked again. A split screen appeared. On the left, one of Zeldin's slides from earlier, showing non-essential green spending. On the right, a real photo from the collapsed mangrove barrier, a firefighter wading through waist-high water carrying an elderly woman. Jasmine didn't narrate this one. She let the image breathe. The silence returned, but this time it belonged to her. And it wasn't empty. It was crushing. She broke it with a whisper. "These aren't just numbers. They're neighborhoods, families, children who now sleep with inhalers under their pillows because someone decided their zip code didn't return enough votes." She stepped slightly to the side of the screen, lowering the remote. "You want to talk about fraud?" Her voice rose, not in volume, but in moral altitude. "You told this country those dollars were wasted. I'm telling you they were working, until you killed them." Another click. A spreadsheet appeared now, not hers, but one leaked from a private contractor. Highlighted in yellow was a column titled Redirected Funds, tracing diverted environmental grants to undisclosed subcontractors in campaign-heavy counties. Jasmine didn't say where she got it. She didn't need to. A murmur broke out in the gallery. Someone in the back, maybe an aide, maybe a journalist, audibly whispered, "Oh my God." Crockett turned toward the panel. "This is what happens when we call survival political, when we weaponize oversight to punish communities instead of protect them. And the cost, it's not theoretical. It's water in lungs. It's mold in bedrooms. It's a flood line 6 feet up a grandmother's wall." The Republican from Montana, who had nodded along with Zeldin an hour earlier, now leaned into a side conversation with his aide. Across the table, a staffer for the Energy Subcommittee scribbled something onto a legal pad. For the first time since the hearing began, the balance of power wasn't numerical. It was visceral. Zeldin still hadn't spoken. His silence now wasn't confidence. It was calculation. Crockett knew it, and she pressed once more. 3,000 homes, 400 children, an entire coastline. Tell me again which of those is a non-essential expenditure. She didn't shout. She didn't even raise her voice. But the words were delivered like a closing argument, the kind that doesn't ask for a verdict, only dares the jury to live with their conscience. She clicked off the screen. The final image faded. No one moved. The room felt vacuum-sealed, oxygen thinned out by the weight of what had just been laid bare. Zeldin's hand unclenched, but he still wouldn't meet her gaze. Because in that moment, it didn't matter what he said next. For everyone in that room, those watching live, those whose lives had been reduced to footnotes, and those who had just witnessed a ledger full of suffering, Jasmine Crockett had already won the argument. The last image faded, but Jasmine Crockett didn't sit down. She stepped forward, slow, deliberate, toward the central microphone like someone walking into the heart of a storm she had already survived. Her pace wasn't rushed. It wasn't performative. It was rooted. Like the truth she carried needed no dramatics, only air to breathe. Every eye in the room followed her as she crossed the short distance. The sound of her heels against the polished floor echoed louder than the applause that had followed Zeldin earlier. This wasn't her rebuttal, it was her reckoning. And the nation, still locked in silence from the images they'd just witnessed, braced itself for what she would say next. She reached the mic and didn't adjust it. She didn't shuffle papers or clear her throat. She simply stood there, one hand resting gently on the wood, the other curled around the edge of her notepad. Her eyes locked not on the committee, not on Zeldin, not even on the spectators. She looked directly into the camera, straight into the homes of millions of Americans watching on their phones, their laptops, their living room TVs. If a budget doesn't protect the most vulnerable, she said, each word measured like it had been weighed against something too sacred to dilute, then who exactly is it serving? She let that question hang, not as rhetoric, but as indictment. It wasn't aimed only at Zeldin. It pierced through every layer of power sitting before her, and every voter who ever believed that cutting dollars meant cutting excess rather than cutting lives. It was the kind of question that didn't ask for a reply. It demanded a mirror. No one dared speak. The room wasn't just quiet, it was transfixed. You could hear the hum of the lights above, the mechanical blink of a camera autofocus. Zeldin sat motionless, his fingers now twitching slightly against the edge of his desk. Whatever thunder he had unleashed minutes before was now being swallowed whole. Jasmine turned a page on her notepad, slow and careful, revealing a single name in black ink. Angela Medina. She looked down at it, then back to the camera, her expression softening, but her voice only grew firmer. She was a single mother, Jasmine began, lived with her 2 boys in South Corpus Christi, half a mile from an open-air chemical disposal site. You want to talk about oversight? That community didn't even get warning signs. They got coughs, rashes, night sweats. They asked for one thing, a real-time air monitoring station. Not a favor, not a luxury, just a way to know when the air might be trying to kill them. She paused and the ache in her voice started to show, not from weakness, but from memory. It got approved, she said. We fought for it, and we got it. For 3 weeks, the foundation was poured. The sensor was in transit. Then the funding was cut. The contractor disappeared. And Angela, she went back to boiling water and sleeping with the windows taped shut. Jasmine's hand trembled slightly as she turned the next page. There was no photo this time. Only a medical bill, half folded and annotated in red pen. Her youngest, Noah, has been hospitalized 4 times this year. He's 8. He sleeps with his inhaler wrapped in a washcloth so it doesn't get lost under his pillow. Angela's already had to choose between his meds and her rent. Her voice dipped, not low but deep, the kind of deep that pulls the floor out from beneath you. She didn't ask for politics, Jasmine said. She asked for air. No one moved, not even the stenographer, whose fingers hovered for half a beat too long before remembering to keep typing. Then Jasmine stepped even closer to the mic, close enough for the camera to catch the wetness beginning to gather at the corners of her eyes. But she didn't let it fall. She held it, contained it, and redirected its weight. People don't need a speech about data, she said, voice breaking in a way that made the truth sharper. They need to live. Those 5 words did more than silence a room. They leveled it, broke it down to something human, something too often missing in hearings like this one, where suffering is translated into spreadsheets and dismissed as statistical error. And then something rare happened. A sound broke through the quiet, not words, not protest, a scrape. the sound of wood on marble as one of the Republican senators on the far left side of the bench pushed back his chair and stood, slowly, respectfully, no grand gesture, just a man rising, then another, a Democrat, then three more. One of them clapped, soft at first, uncertain if this was appropriate, but then came the ripple, a second clap, a third, then hands, many hands, meeting palm to palm. Some slow, some shaky, some unsure. But then it spread. The sound became steady, defiant, unified. The hearing room, once divided by policy and party lines, now moved as one body. Even those who had come in hostile, defensive, ready for a fight, they stood. Not because they agreed with Jasmine's politics, but because something bigger than politics had just taken the floor. She didn't acknowledge the applause, didn't let it absorb her. She stood still, her hand still on the notepad, the name still visible, the paper trembling just slightly under the tension she refused to let go. Her expression never shifted to pride or relief, because this wasn't a victory, it was a cry for help, and the real work hadn't even begun. And across the table, for the first time since the hearing began, Lee Zeldin finally looked up. But he didn't speak, because deep down, even he knew, no chart could save him from what had just been made visible. The applause faded, but its echo still hung in the air like smoke after a battlefield volley. So when Lee Zeldin finally rose from his seat, it wasn't with triumph, but with something far more fragile, the need to reclaim control. He didn't leap to his feet like before. No surge of righteousness, no sharp movements. This time it was measured, cautious. A man who had just watched the room, and possibly the nation, slip through his fingers. He reached for his microphone and adjusted it, but the gesture lacked the firm precision he had earlier. There was weight now, not in the facts he was about to present, but in the silence they followed, a silence built not on decorum, but on exposure. Still, he cleared his throat and steadied his voice, reaching back for the conviction he had entered with. "I'm not attacking communities," he said, trying to restore the line between intent and consequence. "I'm attacking a broken system, a spending mechanism with no safeguards, no oversight, and no consequence for failure." He motioned toward the monitors behind him, but they remained dark. It was a hollow gesture, and everyone in the room knew it. The visual war had already been lost. He was no longer speaking with the power of images, but with the fragility of justification. And yet he pushed forward, dragging the spotlight back onto structure and policy, hoping that somewhere in the rules he could find redemption. "Some of these projects were cut," he continued, his voice steadier now, more like a man explaining his actions to a jury, "because local authorities failed to meet even the minimum reporting requirements. There were no updates, no benchmarks, no proof of impact. What was I supposed to do? Keep pouring money into silence?" He didn't look up after that question, didn't scan the room. It was rhetorical but not confident. It landed like a stone skipping once before sinking. His voice remained even, but the rhythm had changed. The clipped delivery was now padded with hesitation, his cadence wrapped in caution. The fire was gone, replaced by the slow walk of someone trying to separate intent from effect. "Fraud is not the same as failure," he added, glancing down at a document he no longer seemed interested in. "We have to distinguish between programs that serve and programs that siphon." It was a fair point on paper, but in this room, in this moment, it was missing the oxygen it needed to catch fire. No heads nodded, no pens scribbled. Even his allies across the bench avoided eye contact. They weren't turning on him. They were retreating from the heat of a truth they couldn't refute. He stood in the same space Jasmine Crockett had stood only moments before. But where she had filled it with moral clarity, with breathless consequence, Zeldin filled it with protocol. It wasn't wrong. It simply wasn't enough. Across from him, Jasmine remained still. Her arms now rested gently on the desk in front of her, but her gaze hadn't softened. She wasn't glaring. She wasn't smirking. She was simply watching, like someone listening to a man describe smoke after she had already walked through the fire. He wanted to reframe the story as a structural critique, to redirect the nation's gaze away from the human cost and back to the bureaucratic process. But the room had already seen too much, and so had the country. For the first time, Zeldin understood. He wasn't just defending policy, he was defending damage. The silence after Jasmine's final line wasn't empty, it was charged. And just when it seemed the room might return to equilibrium, she reached for one last document, and the air snapped taut again like a live wire pulled too tight. She held it differently this time, not just for visibility, but like it was evidence in a courtroom, the kind that changes everything. The pages were heavier, not in weight but in consequence. She turned them outward as she stepped back into the center of the chamber, letting the seal catch the light. EPA, Whistleblower File 11G/Restricted Access. The headers were technical, cold, programmatic reallocation procedures, tiered funding authorizations, Q4 redistributions. But the story inside them was radioactive. Jasmine let the paper hang between her thumb and forefinger, then looked straight at the dais, her voice quiet but locked with steel. "This document was handed to me by someone who had everything to lose," she said. "They've worked in the EPA for 14 years. They've overseen 3 administrations, and last month they walked into my office with trembling hands and said, 'I can't be silent anymore.'" Her hand trembled too now, but she kept her voice steady. This wasn't about a failed program. This wasn't about trimming waste. This was about covering tracks. She flipped to a section midway through the page and read aloud, each word ringing out like a charge being filed. "Reallocation of public climate infrastructure funds approved under discretionary authority to be redirected toward privately owned innovation centers in alignment with strategic legislative partnerships." She paused. The room didn't. A wave of quiet panic rippled through the staffers seated behind their senators. Screens lit up again, reporters typing furiously, interns exchanging glances, someone silently mouthing, "Jesus Christ." Jasmine turned to the panel and stepped closer, her finger landing on a line halfway down the second page. "Not only were these funds diverted," she said, "they were never intended to return. The communities that were defunded had no warning, no option to reapply, no notification at all." Her eyes swept the room now, locking with each lawmaker's gaze for just a breath. "We were told there was a shortage, that there wasn't enough to go around. That's not true." She turned sharply toward Zeldin, her voice until now measured and reflective, now cut like a knife through fog. "It was never a lack of money." Her eyes narrowed. "It was money sent the wrong way." A murmur erupted, but she raised her hand, not to quiet the room, but to point directly at him. "You didn't cut because you believed in saving taxpayers' money," she said, each word like the crack of a gavel. "You cut because you were covering for those who benefited from a system designed to exploit the very people you claim to defend." Zeldin didn't blink, but his hand, resting until now on his stack of rebuttal notes, pulled slowly away. He folded his arms, defensive. His lips parted slightly, then closed again. There was nothing to say. Because in front of him stood not an opponent, but a witness, a prosecutor, a woman carrying more than documents. She carried the weight of every child who coughed through the night, every mother who boiled water she'd already paid to have cleaned, every neighborhood crossed off a ledger in a building where no one ever breathed their air. Jasmine laid the file flat on the desk, then stood tall. "You want to call this a debate? You want to posture behind charts and contract codes?" Her voice grew, not louder, but deeper, pulled from something raw and righteous. "This wasn't policy. This was collusion. And the cost wasn't numbers. It was breath, it was blood, it was lives." She stepped back from the microphone, but before she turned away, she gave one final glance back to Zeldin. "You didn't just fail them. You erased them." And for the first time since the hearing began, even the cameras felt intrusive. Because this wasn't politics anymore. This was testimony, and Jasmine Crockett had just handed the nation its evidence. The room was still reeling from Jasmine Crockett's final line, an accusation not just aimed at one man, but at the entire machine. And while the silence inside the chamber held like a clenched fist, outside, the country had already begun to explode. Within minutes, the hearing footage had been clipped, captioned and posted across social media. The hashtag number sign #GreenSlushGate ignited like a match dropped on dry grass. On Twitter, it shot from a few dozen posts to trending nationwide in less than 20 minutes. Activists, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike began reposting Jasmine's confrontation, tagging their senators, calling out names. She brought receipts, one user wrote. No more hiding behind the word efficiency while kids choke. On Facebook, the video of Jasmine pointing directly at Zeldin and saying, "You cut because you were covering for those who benefited," was being shared faster than the platforms could count. By noon, it had reached over 14 million views and had been subtitled in 5 languages by volunteer accounts across Europe and Latin America. Major media outlets broke in. CNN interrupted its regular programming with a banner that read, "Breaking. Representative Jasmine Crockett accuses colleagues of redirecting funds for political favors." But it wasn't just the media. It was the public. It was personal. And then came the voice that shattered what little plausible deniability was left. Live on air, during CNN's midday political roundtable, an anchor suddenly cut away from the panelists. "We've just received a call from a former senior official at the Environmental Protection Agency who says they want to speak directly to what's unfolding," the host said. "We verified their identity and we're putting them on now." The screen split, revealing only a blurred silhouette and altered voice. The caption read, "Confidential, former EPA administrator, 2009 to 2020. Then the voice came calm and devastating. What Representative Crockett said in that room was not only true, it barely scratched the surface. During my tenure, several of us attempted to audit these reallocation patterns. We were denied access, not due to classification, not due to security, but because we were told off the record that these grants had been politically pre-cleared." The studio fell silent. Even the anchor didn't interject. "We had reason to believe certain congressional offices were directing environmental funds into private projects that had no scientific oversight, no community integration, and in some cases, no actual infrastructure. Every time we filed an internal review, we were redirected or delayed until the quarter closed and the money had been moved. We were blocked. I was blocked." The voice stopped. The anchor, visibly shaken, finally asked, "So you're saying this wasn't just mismanagement?" There was a pause. "No," the voice said. "It was obstruction, with intent." That sentence was clipped and shared over 28 million times within the next 8 hours. Political analysts compared it to the Pentagon Papers. On TikTok, young creators were remixing the footage with overlays of Jasmine Crockett's speech, calling her the people's prosecutor. College campuses across the country launched rapid teach-ins. Faculty uploaded videos breaking down the EPA whistleblower file line by line. In Baltimore, a group of students projected Jasmine's speech onto the side of a dormitory at night, visible for blocks. It was never about a lack of money. It was money sent the wrong way. Inside the Capitol, the mood changed instantly. Staffers who once shrugged off environmental hearings as low priority now had emergency meetings booked through the night. Senators issued half-hearted statements, trying to reframe their support for the cuts as trust in the system, only to be torched online within minutes. And at the center of it all was Jasmine Crockett, who had walked into that hearing as a congresswoman and walked out as something more. A flashpoint, a reckoning, a mirror held up to a system too used to looking away. Because in less than an hour, she hadn't just changed the course of a hearing. She had turned the entire country to face the truth. As the country convulsed with headlines, hashtags, and whistleblower revelations, inside the chamber, the storm had reached its quietest and most dangerous eye. Lee Zeldin knew it, and when he finally spoke again, his voice didn't rise. It dropped. Gone was the fierce certainty that had launched his opening attack. Now there was hesitation in the way he adjusted his tie, in how his hands found one another on the table like he was anchoring himself against the undertow. The silence in the room was no longer a pause. It was pressure, dense and inescapable. The world outside was on fire with the footage, with Jasmine's lines etched into timelines and headlines, with the EPA whistleblower's voice looping through every major network. Inside this room, Zeldin wasn't facing a political opponent anymore. He was facing the weight of being seen. He cleared his throat. the microphone catching the slight tremor in his breath. "I will be reviewing every single project that was impacted by the restructuring decisions," he said, eyes low, voice slower than before, like each word cost him something. "In light of the documents presented today and the testimony provided by Representative Crockett, I believe it is appropriate that we—" A pause, not for effect, but because the air around him had thickened. This was the moment. The nation watching knew it. Every reporter in the room knew it. The moral collision had happened. Now came the part where a man chose whether to stand inside the wreckage or pretend it never happened. But Zeldin didn't bend. "I will support the formation of a bipartisan oversight committee to evaluate the flow of environmental grants and ensure accountability moving forward." It was a maneuver, not a reckoning, not an apology. He stayed in the language of systems, review, oversight, accountability. But nowhere in that polished phrasing did the word sorry appear. Nowhere did he acknowledge the images on Jasmine's screen, the oxygen tanks, the collapsed mangrove defenses, the little girl with the washcloth-wrapped inhaler. His defense wasn't denial, it was distance. A man still clinging to process in a room that had been cracked wide open by consequence. For a moment he held his breath as if expecting nods, a lifeline, a gesture of shared responsibility from someone, anyone, but none came. And across the chamber, Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She remained in the same posture she had held through his speech, still, focused, unflinching. Her silence was no longer a strategy, it was the verdict. She didn't look impressed. She didn't look angry. She looked like a woman who had fought too long to be baited into satisfaction by bureaucratic cleanup. She looked like someone who had heard too many promises, watched too many committees form, and vanished without a single home repaired or clinic reopened. She had opened a wound that had been hidden under funding codes and redacted memos. She had shown them the pain behind the spreadsheets, and now the man responsible stood there offering paperwork and process instead of truth. Zeldin shifted in his seat, eyes flickering up to meet hers. Still, she said nothing. But in that silence, there was more judgment than any cross-examination could deliver, more power than any soundbite could replicate, because Jasmine Crockett had already done the one thing every lobbyist, every back-channel operative, every well-oiled congressional cover story fears most. She had told the truth, not with venom, not with volume, but with undeniable, unrelenting clarity. And now every word that came after it, every half-measured concession, was swallowed by the roar of what had already been exposed. Zeldin adjusted his mic again, though no one had asked for more. "We must ensure this never happens again," he said, though the room understood that it already had. Many times. Just not on camera, not under these lights, not with a woman who refused to blink while the weight of a broken system tried to outlast her. He sat back. The words were done. Jasmine didn't respond. She didn't need to. Because in this hearing, she wasn't there to debate. She was there to deliver. And she had. The hearing may have ended, but the fallout had only just begun. And by the time the gavel struck wood for adjournment, Washington was already bracing for impact. Hours later, as dusk fell over the Capitol dome, a rare urgency seized the corridors of Congress. Phones rang without pause. Staffers pored over grant logs and memos once buried deep in subcommittee archives. And at 7:14 p.m. Eastern Time, a line of text flashed across every major network's breaking news banner. House of Representatives opens emergency investigation into environmental grant mismanagement in 6 states. What had started as a single woman's testimony had ignited a congressional wildfire. By unanimous consent of the Oversight Committee and under pressure from both parties, the House authorized a sweeping probe into the reallocation of federal environmental funds spanning Louisiana, Florida, New Jersey, Michigan, Texas, and New York. This wasn't symbolic, it was systemic. Within minutes, subpoenas were drafted, internal documents requested. Federal inspectors, long silenced under bureaucratic fog, were reactivated and reassigned. The mandate was clear: identify who authorized the cuts, where the money went, and whether political affiliations influenced its path. But behind the procedural language was something much more volatile: fear. Because what Jasmine Crockett had exposed wasn't just mishandling, it was betrayal of communities who'd been promised clean air and safe water and were instead handed excuses and silence. One by one, news crews descended on neighborhoods named in Jasmine's testimony. In Baton Rouge, a mother held up a photo of her son's collapsed lungs and said, "We were never told the funds were gone. We just stopped getting visits." In the Bronx, a school nurse opened her logbook on live TV and showed a spike in asthma attacks from the month the air monitor was removed. "We kept asking why," she said, eyes tired. "Now we know." And as these stories spread, a second wave began. Quiet but potent. Insiders, contractors, mid-level EPA officials. One by one, they began stepping forward. Not all on camera, not all with documents, but each with pieces. One text message confirming political pressure, one email redlining a community because it didn't fit funding optics, one report marked sensitive that tracked donations from consulting firms back to campaign war chests. It didn't matter that Zeldin had tried to pivot. The center of gravity had shifted. This wasn't his terrain anymore. This was Crockett's war now. And in the halls of Congress, there was a reckoning forming, not around party lines, but around something raw and dangerous to the establishment. Truth with evidence, delivered in front of cameras and backed by a voice the public trusted. For decades, hearings had been theater. This time someone had brought receipts, and the entire country was watching Act Two begin with subpoenas, not applause. As the investigations expanded and headlines refused to fade, a new invitation arrived, one not issued by party leaders or media pundits, but by those who had been watching Jasmine Crockett not as a politician, but as a force. And this time she wasn't asked to testify. She was asked to lead. Less than 10 days after the hearing, Jasmine was named the keynote speaker at the National Summit on Equitable Budgeting, a high-stakes live broadcast gathering of economists, civic leaders, policy watchdogs, and state officials from all 50 states. It wasn't just an honor, it was a statement. For years, this summit had been dominated by think tank elites and CBO veterans, men in suits who spoke in formulas and footnotes. But this year, the nation had seen something else. A woman who used a crumpled photograph and a whistleblower file to detonate decades of sanitized deception. And the crowd wanted to hear her unfiltered. The ballroom in Chicago's McCormick Place was overflowing. Security lines wrapped around the block. Inside, the air buzzed with electricity, not the polite anticipation of a scheduled speaker, but the live wire tension of someone about to rewrite the rules in real time. As the MC announced her name, the applause didn't simply rise. It thundered, erupting from corners of the room, packed with community organizers, college students, local mayors, and parents who had watched her confrontation with Lee Zeldin more times than they could count. Jasmine walked on stage alone, no entourage, no speech in hand. Just a single black folder, worn at the edges, the same one she had brought to the hearing. She stood at the podium, adjusted the mic, and let the applause die down on its own. Her eyes scanned the room, but not like someone checking a crowd. More like someone finding faces in it, people who looked like home. She began not with a policy proposal, but a memory. "I grew up on the street where garbage trucks came twice a week, but clean water never did," she said, voice low, unshaken. "Where asthma wasn't a statistic, it was a sound you woke up to at night." The room stilled. She continued, stepping away from the podium, her voice rising not in volume but in clarity. "Budgets are not spreadsheets. They are moral documents. They are stories of who we choose to protect and who we decide can wait." Then she held up the black folder and opened it. From inside, she pulled the same EPA whistleblower memo she'd used in the hearing, now encased in a plastic sleeve. "This," she said, "is what hiding accountability looks like. Redacted lines, disappeared funds, and communities turned into margins." She set the file down and looked back at the crowd. Her gaze held firm. "I wasn't invited to that hearing because I was loud. I was invited because I refused to let silence win." The audience rose before she could say another word. People wept. People shouted. And amid the roar, Jasmine didn't smile. She stood still, shoulders squared, as if anchoring herself for what was coming next. Because this wasn't a moment, it was a beginning, and she knew it. And as Jasmine stepped off the stage, the standing ovation still echoing in her ears, a staffer approached, not with fanfare, not with policy briefs or press questions, but with something smaller, more human. A plain white envelope, folded neatly, slightly smudged with graphite and fingerprints. No return address, no congressional letterhead. Just 4 words written carefully in pencil, across the front in the hand of a child. For Ms. Crockett, please. She accepted it without a word, her hand tightening slightly as if already sensing the weight inside wasn't measured in paper, but in something far heavier. It wasn't until she reached the green room backstage, the applause now muffled by concrete walls and hallway silence, that she sat down alone and opened it. Inside was a single sheet of wide-ruled notebook paper, torn unevenly at the top, with writing that danced between shaky and determined. Crayon hearts lined the top and bottom in pink and blue. The message itself was short: no policy, no hashtags, no slogans. Dear Ms. Crockett, thank you for fighting so we can breathe. It was signed Ava J., age 10, Bronx. Below the signature, in colored pencil, was a drawing. 2 figures, one small, with brown curls and a dress, the other taller, holding a microphone, with a blue cape sweeping behind her. There were no crowds, no cameras, no flags, just a sun in the corner and a building labeled school, with hearts floating above it like birds. Jasmine stared at it for a long time. She had read internal memos scrawled in bureaucratic doublespeak. She had parsed through audit logs and redacted emails, testimony transcripts and grant summaries. She had fought with logic, with facts, with fury and restraint, and relentless truth. But this was the purest record of impact. This wasn't for the cameras. This wasn't for the front page. Ava didn't write her name expecting recognition. She wrote it because she could breathe a little easier, and because someone finally said her breath mattered. Jasmine read the letter again, slower now, the words heavier on the second pass. And for a moment, the whirlwind around her, the hearings, the headlines, the trending hashtags, fell away. What was left was a single girl in a borough too often neglected, a girl who had never met her, but had felt her defense like a shield she didn't even know she had. Ava didn't mention asthma. She didn't need to. She didn't mention the air monitors that disappeared from her school's roof 6 months ago. The way her older brother had to walk her home early on high-alert pollution days, or how her mother stood in front of local reporters, holding up an empty inhaler and begging for someone, anyone, to listen. Numbers, she just said, thank you. Jasmine folded the paper slowly, the corners creasing perfectly, like muscle memory from 100 other letters she'd carried in the past, from other kids, other fights, other frontline families. But this one was different, because this one came after the headlines, after the whistleblower, after the moment when power was forced to face its reflection and didn't like what it saw. She slipped the letter into the inside pocket of her blazer, directly over her chest, not for show, for strength, because she knew this wasn't the end. The subpoenas were just beginning, the machines that redirected money, rewrote intent, and erased communities in the margins. They were still humming in the background, still cloaked in layers of language that buried harm in procedure. But now, for the first time, they were being seen. And not just by journalists or committee members or TV hosts. They were being seen by the children who lived in the fallout, the ones who were told they didn't count, who watched the filters vanish from their classrooms and the water fountains run dry, the ones who for years learned to endure what others ignored, and who now, thanks to a woman with a folder full of truth, had found a voice for their breath. As Jasmine stood again, a soft knock came at the door, her team reminding her she had another meeting, another interview, another room full of people waiting to hear what came next. She straightened her shoulders, took one last breath, and reached for her folder. But she didn't carry only documents anymore. Now she carried Ava. And in that quiet corner behind the stage, Jasmine Crockett understood the real scale of what had just begun. The budget battle was still raging. The investigations would take months. The backlash would come, funded and furious. But something had already shifted, something that couldn't be undone. Because justice, for the first time in a long time, had spoken through a child's pencil, and the whole world was listening. And as Jasmine Crockett walked out of that backstage hallway, Ava's letter pressed over her heart like armor. Something deeper than applause followed her. Not reporters, not staff, something unseen but weighty, like a shift in atmosphere when a storm has passed but the ground still trembles beneath your feet. The air was heavy not with noise, but with meaning. For the first time in weeks, Jasmine wasn't walking into another battle. She was walking through the stillness after truth had landed, and nothing, not even silence, could make it go away. Because what had happened in that hearing room, what echoed through that summit, and what now pulsed through millions of screens and hearts across the country, was not just a political flashpoint. It was something more permanent, something human. It was a moment when a woman stood up, not just for the statistics buried under bureaucracy, but for the breath of those who had never been granted the dignity of being seen, let alone defended. Jasmine's battle wasn't one with rage or rhetoric. It was one with unflinching clarity, with a kind of courage forged not in party strategy rooms, but in the lived experience of neighborhoods where the system didn't just fail, it never even showed up. And what she proved, what this fight exposed in real time, was that injustice doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it wears a suit, it holds a spreadsheet, it signs a grant denial with a pen that never once trembles while crossing out a ZIP code. Sometimes injustice is polite, procedural, and built into the structure itself. That's what Jasmine fought, a machine that didn't need to scream to do violence. It simply needed to forget, to delay, to deflect, to review. But Jasmine didn't let them forget. She dragged those numbers into daylight and made them bleed truth. She forced the powerful to hear what it sounds like when someone tells them, "You didn't just cut funding, you cut breath." She carried the weight of neighborhoods where kids memorized inhaler schedules the way others memorize math tables, where families boil their water in silence, ashamed of their shame, where mothers like Ava's tuck their children in at night, not with lullabies, but with whispered prayers that tomorrow's air won't hurt more than today's. And here's the hard part, the brutal, cinematic, breathtaking truth that Jasmine's stand revealed. Justice is not the natural state of power. It is not automatic. It does not emerge from committee. It does not grow from convenience or comfort. Justice must be forced into existence, wrestled into being, and almost always demanded by someone willing to lose everything so someone else can finally breathe. In Jasmine Crockett, the nation saw that kind of fighter. Not perfect, not polished, not invited, but present, relentless. Unapologetic in the way only someone who has lived close to the edge of injustice can be. She didn't come to ask for permission. She came to force accountability to remember who it's supposed to serve. And that's the real lesson. That public service without empathy is theater. That budgets without humanity are weapons. That leadership without truth is just a longer form of delay. Jasmine turned all of that upside down. Not with slogans, but with a letter from a 10-year-old girl who saw her on TV and knew instinctively that something had shifted. "Thank you for fighting so we can breathe." 9 words. That's it. 9 words that mattered more than a 1,000-page report, and those words are now part of the permanent record, not the congressional one, but the one etched into the conscience of everyone who watched, everyone who finally saw what the cost of indifference looks like and what it takes to interrupt it. Jasmine Crockett didn't just confront a man, she confronted a structure, a rhythm, a long silence that had taught generations to accept less. And in doing so, she cracked it. Now the systems will stall. They'll try to reframe it, to outweight the outrage, to grind the moral momentum down to a dull buzz. But that letter exists. Those hearings exist. That moment when an entire room rose to its feet exists. And so does Jasmine's voice, forever captured in the kind of clarity that outlives spin. Because the lesson, the raw, human, irreversible lesson, is this. Power is real, but so is breath. Budgets are numbers, but justice is who gets to breathe. And in a world built to forget, remembering is revolutionary. Jasmine Crockett didn't just remind us, she made us remember. And now, finally, we cannot look away. And if Jasmine Crockett made the nation remember, then the only question that remains is, what are we going to do with that memory now? This cannot be where it ends. Not with applause, not with hashtags, not with promises from officials suddenly forced into the light. Because what happened in that chamber was not the conclusion of a scandal. It was the unmasking of a system. We saw the wires. We saw the hands. We saw how neatly injustice can be folded into paperwork and filed under procedure. And now that we've seen it, we have only two choices: return to comfort and pretend it never happened, or rise. Rise with the urgency of those who no longer have the luxury of waiting for the next tragedy to justify our action. Because for every Ava who wrote a letter, there are thousands who couldn't breathe long enough to pick up a pencil. We are not bystanders anymore. Jasmine didn't speak for us so we could sit back in admiration. She cracked the door so we could blow it open. Her voice was not a conclusion. It was a baton, and now it's in our hands. If you're outraged, good. Stay that way. Let it be fuel, not fatigue. Call your representatives, not tomorrow. Today, not once, repeatedly. Demand that the House Oversight Committee's investigation expand beyond 6 states. Demand that EPA contracts be made public, that whistleblower protections be enforced, that communities most affected be granted a permanent seat at the table, not just during crisis, but in every budgeting cycle moving forward. Don't wait for another leader to emerge. Don't expect another Jasmine. Be her. In your block, in your school board, in your water district. Organize community budget forums. Create local oversight collectives. Host town halls in barbershops, libraries, churches, wherever breadth and truth are needed. The machinery of injustice relies on complexity to hide its crimes. So bring a flashlight. Simplify it. Name it. Expose it. And if you are someone within the system, an EPA employee, a contractor, a staffer sitting on documents that don't feel right, speak. Now, there will never be a perfect time. There will only be silence or truth, and only one of those will protect the people who need you. Because this isn't about sides, this is about breath, about children sleeping with their windows taped shut while contractors buy lakefront homes with redirected funds. This is about mothers boiling water while CEOs cash bonus checks labeled climate innovation. This is about a system that gambled with air and water and lost nothing, because someone else always paid the price. So to every journalist, don't let the next story drown out this one. To every lawyer, draft model legislation for funding transparency. To every artist, paint Jasmine's words into murals. Make them unignorable. To every voter, remember every name that tried to bury this and make them answer for it. To every teacher, put this case study into your curriculum. Teach civic courage the way we teach civic compromise. Because this is history now, the moment where a budget hearing became a national reckoning, and whether or not that reckoning becomes real change depends on you. And to the comfortable, to the ones whose neighborhoods never had to worry about air quality alerts or lead levels in the drinking fountains, this is your fight too. Not because you were affected, but because you weren't. And because privilege without purpose is just quiet permission for suffering to continue unchecked. So do not let Jasmine Crockett's courage become an isolated moment in the archives of democracy. Let it be a match. Let it be a blueprint. Let it be the start of a movement that refuses to end at the sound of a gavel. Because justice is not self-sustaining. It is not automatic. It does not flow downhill. It must be pulled forward by hands that refuse to let go. This is the part where you stop watching the story unfold and start writing the next chapter. The budget war is still raging, so rage with it. Fight not for victory, but for visibility. Not for applause, but for breath. Not because someone else asked you to, but because now you know too much to ever look away again. And if this fight has taught us anything, it's this. The greatest danger to justice isn't outrage, it's fatigue. It's the slow return to apathy after the fire dies down. The assumption that someone else will pick up the torch, follow through on the subpoenas, show up to the next committee vote, or protect the communities still choking in the shadows. But that's the lie. The truth? Injustice doesn't take breaks. It doesn't sleep. It doesn't wait for the news cycle to return. It hides in moments of public exhaustion, in the quiet corners where accountability slips through the cracks, because no one stayed long enough to hold the line. So we must hold it, and not just now, consistently, because real change, the kind that rewrites systems and not just headlines, doesn't come from a single explosion of truth. It comes from sustained disruption, from people like you refusing to move on, from people writing letters to editors, attending budget hearings in person, reviewing district-level spending documents, asking hard questions at town halls. It comes from showing up on nights when no one else does, from reading the footnotes, from demanding that the most complicated parts of governance be translated into terms that can be understood and defended by the very people those policies claim to serve. And that's where the next battle lies. Not just in Washington, not just in the EPA or appropriations committees, but in local water boards, in school maintenance budgets, in city planning meetings where the decisions are quiet, but the consequences are loud. That's where the machinery of inequality rebuilds itself when we're not looking. And that's where we must plant ourselves with the same fire Jasmine Crockett carried into that chamber. You don't need a title to be dangerous to injustice. You need clarity. You need persistence. You need to know exactly what is at stake when money disappears and no one explains where it went. You need to remember that for some communities, cutbacks mean casualties, and that defending those communities doesn't require sainthood. It requires showing up when the cameras are gone. So ask yourself right now, what will I do with what I now know? Will I treat this as a powerful story and move on? Or will I treat it as my marching order? Because if Ava's letter taught us anything, it's that the smallest voice can carry the weight of the entire truth, and the right words spoken at the right time can pierce through layers of denial, politics, and power. Now it's your voice, and it's your time. Don't just admire what Jasmine Crockett did. Emulate it, amplify it, expand it. This story didn't go viral by accident. It struck something that people had been holding back for far too long: the need to breathe freely, not just in our lungs, but in our systems. To breathe without fear, to live without being rendered invisible by a budget line, to matter. And if that matters to you, start acting like it. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. Washington, D.C. Under the blistering glare of studio lights and the watchful eye of a nation, Jasmine Crockett is invited by Pam for what's billed as a civil conversation on race and leadership. But when Pam accuses Jasmine of performing blackness for political gain, the air turns razor sharp. Jasmine doesn't shout. She leans in, delivers a single line about her mother that slices through generations of silence, and in that moment, everything flips. What will Pam do when the spotlight no longer flatters, the script no longer shields her, and the truth she buried for years now stands before her, calm, unshaken, and utterly undeniable? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The email arrived at 2:13 a.m., unsigned, impersonal, and cold as steel. Representative Crockett, you are invited to appear on The Megyn Kelly Show for a live discussion on race, identity, and authenticity in American politics. No mention of compensation, no talk of structure, just a thinly veiled challenge dressed up as civility. Jasmine read the subject line twice. Her chief of staff immediately flagged it as a trap. She wants to humiliate you on live air. Don't feed the machine. But Jasmine stared at the message, unmoved. She knew this wasn't about her comfort. This was about the millions of Americans who never got an invitation to speak for themselves. The ones who were spoken about, not to. We walk into traps, she whispered, when we believe the truth will survive the ambush. Across the country in a Manhattan studio dressed like a war room, Megyn Kelly was rehearsing. Not lines, ambushes. Her producers had combed through Jasmine's social media, dissected her voice, highlighted every moment she had ever sounded too black or acted too proud. The plan was precise. Poke the bear, play the victim, let the internet do the rest. Kelly didn't want dialogue. She wanted dominance. And she was confident. After all, she had outmaneuvered senators, celebrities, and even a sitting president. "She's emotional," Megan said flatly to her team. "She'll crack." The room nodded, and someone muttered, "Let's make her a meme before breakfast." But in Washington, Jasmine Crockett was preparing too, just not the way they expected. No team of stylists, no spin doctors, just silence, a stack of annotated articles on coded language, a worn copy of The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, and a photo of her mother tucked into her folder like a loaded weapon. Her mother, who marched through Texas heat for voting rights and was called colored in hospitals she cleaned. Jasmine didn't need bullet points. She carried history in her bones. She looked at the photo, whispered, "We're going in together," and zipped the folder shut. The transition from off-air silence to live confrontation was nearly imperceptible, except to Jasmine. She felt it in the shift of the air, the calculated tension in Megyn Kelly's smile, the artificial warmth wrapped around a blade. The set was awash in light, sterile and clinical, designed to flatter but also to expose. Viewers across the country saw two women on screen, but only one of them had walked through fire to sit there. Jasmine adjusted her microphone with a calmness she had practiced in courtrooms and congressional hearings. But inside, she felt the familiar heat rising, the heat of being measured, misunderstood, and already miscast before speaking a word. This wasn't a conversation. It was a setup wrapped in civility, and Jasmine knew it the moment the camera blinked red. Megyn Kelly leaned slightly forward in her chair, fingers steepled in practiced elegance. Her voice was perfectly modulated, like a polished instrument playing a dissonant note beneath the surface. "Congresswoman," she began, with a tone that pretended to seek truth but carried the weight of accusation. "There's been some criticism that you and Representative Ocasio-Cortez play a certain role, a kind of urban theater, let's say. Do you think adopting a ghetto persona is a political strategy to connect with voters?" The words didn't echo. They detonated, not with volume, but with implication. Across millions of screens, time seemed to suspend. Technicians froze mid-motion. Even the scrolling comments paused for a breath. The accusation wasn't new, but hearing it framed as a question on national television by a woman who had built a career from shaping narratives while claiming neutrality, it was as chilling as it was familiar. Jasmine's face didn't move for 2 full seconds. Her silence wasn't hesitation. It was containment. She knew that any flash of anger would be looped, clipped, weaponized. So instead she smiled, but not the kind of smile meant to soothe. This was the slow, measured curl of someone who's been underestimated too many times to be surprised anymore. "This," she said, her voice unwavering, "is the voice I use when I talk to my mother, when I tell her I made it through another week without being mistaken for the help. This is my real." She paused, not for effect, but because the next line deserved breath. "But tell me, Megyn, do you pretend to be colorblind because you think it absolves you? While you cut down women like me with the sharp edge of polite racism?" The air left the room. The control booth behind the glass exchanged frantic glances, but no one dared interrupt. Kelly blinked once. Just once. But it was enough. The balance of power, so carefully orchestrated, had shifted. Jasmine didn't gloat. She leaned forward, her posture composed, but her eyes sharper than ever. "Don't mistake your comfort for clarity, and don't confuse our existence with performance. I didn't come here to be decoded. I came here to remind you, we're not auditioning for approval anymore." There were no cheers, no music stings, just silence, and the unmistakable gravity of a truth that had been waiting to be spoken aloud. Jasmine had come to this stage with a single promise to herself. She would not be softened for their consumption, and in that moment, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for every woman who had ever been told her identity was a performance, her voice too loud, her pride too much. The silence didn't settle, it simmered. Jasmine's words had landed like a warning shot, and though Megyn Kelly maintained her signature on-camera poise, something shifted behind her eyes. She straightened in her seat and tilted her chin with the practiced precision of someone who had spent decades in control of the narrative. The smile was gone. In its place was something colder, Conviction weaponized. "I don't see color," she said, her voice calm, flat, and sharpened for impact. "I believe in merit. People should rise based on their capabilities, not their skin tone." To the casual listener, it sounded fair, neutral, even noble. But Jasmine heard the silence behind the words, the kind that erases pain by pretending it doesn't exist. It was the same sanitized script that had been handed down for decades. Erase the wound, and no one has to deal with the blood. Jasmine didn't recoil. She didn't rush to speak. Instead, she allowed the air to hold the weight of what was just said. Then, with the steady hands of someone used to building cases under pressure, she reached into her folder and withdrew a thin stack of papers, highlighted, underlined, annotated in her own handwriting. The room watched as she flipped through them with quiet precision. "Then explain this," she said, holding up a page. Her tone never rose, but it hardened. "A 2023 Pew Research study showed that Black professionals are underrepresented in media leadership by 78%. Not because of a lack of merit, not because of a talent gap, because the decision makers don't see our voices as marketable, unless we perform a version of ourselves they can control." Her eyes stayed locked on Megan's. "That's not an oversight. That's a filter. That's a gate with one key." She turned the page, the soft rustle suddenly deafening in the studio. "When I entered Congress, do you know what the first unsolicited advice I got was?" Her words came slower now, deliberate. "Tone it down. Smooth out your voice. Soften your vowels." She paused. What they meant was, sound less Black. Be less like your community. Make them comfortable. Her voice tightened, not from anger but from something deeper. Memory. Because apparently my voice, our voice, is too much for rooms not used to hearing truth without apology. Megan said nothing. The air felt thinner now, the space between them pulsing with unspoken truths. Jasmine leaned forward, not to intimidate, but to ensure her next words left no room for misinterpretation. "That's not meritocracy. That's assimilation through erasure. That's being told you can stay as long as you leave yourself at the door." The sentence hung in the air, suspended between them like a verdict. She didn't stop. "Colorblindness is not a virtue," she said, eyes unwavering. "It's not a solution. It's an abdication, a refusal to acknowledge the systems that reward some and silence others. It's not justice. It's denial dressed up in moral disguise." She didn't flinch. She didn't fumble. And most importantly, she didn't filter herself to soothe the discomfort across the aisle or across the table. The woman on that stage wasn't asking to be understood. She was demanding to be heard. And for the first time that broadcast, Megyn Kelly had no response. The air had barely settled after Jasmine's searing truth when Megyn shifted tactics. She didn't contest the data. She didn't confront the lived experience Jasmine laid bare. Instead, with a measured breath and the precision of a performer hitting her cue, Megyn reached beneath the table and clicked a small remote. The studio monitor lit up behind them, bathing the set in a cold blue light. "Let's take a look," she said flatly. On the screen, Jasmine Crockett at a congressional hearing, articulate, restrained, surgical in tone. The clip cut abruptly. Now Jasmine again, but this time in a TikTok video, laughter in her voice, cadence flowing like homegrown rhythm, unapologetically rooted in her cultural identity. Two versions of the same woman, same intellect, same fire, different tones. Megyn didn't look at Jasmine when she spoke next. She turned to the camera, to the audience she knew was already forming opinions. "You shift," she said, her voice calm but pointed, laced with accusation that masqueraded as observation. "You change your voice depending on who's watching. You're not being real, Congresswoman. You're performing to manipulate the crowd. That's not truth. That's strategy." There it was, delivered with the precision of someone used to controlling the narrative. But behind her cool delivery was something more dangerous. A belief that Blackness, when expressed freely and without apology, was a performance rather than a person. Jasmine remained still, the glow of the screen casting a flickering edge across her cheekbones. She didn't wince, didn't rush to defend herself. Instead, she sat in the discomfort, Let it stretch. Let it breathe. Because she knew this moment wasn't just about her. It was about every black professional who'd ever been told they were too much in one room and not enough in another. It was about the young girl who shifted her tone to survive her classroom and her job interview, who trimmed her cultural inflections like branches to fit through corporate doors. It was about survival and how it's repackaged as deceit when white America decides they don't like the shape it takes. The audience may not have understood the weight of what had just happened, but Jasmine did. She let the clip finish, let the silence that followed be louder than anything said. Then she turned slowly toward Megan, not with fury, but with devastating clarity. You just showed the world exactly why we switch. The sting of Jasmine's final statement, you just showed the world exactly why we switch, still lingered like smoke after a controlled detonation. The studio was silent, but the tension had taken on a different texture now. It wasn't anticipation. It was reckoning. Jasmine didn't shift in her seat. She didn't fidget or avert her eyes. She sat with the stillness of someone who had carried too many accusations to be shaken by one more. Her voice, when it came again, was low but commanding, every syllable grounded in lived truth. I'm a lawyer. I'm a woman. I'm a Texan. I'm black. Each word was a stone laid carefully, deliberately into a foundation that had been tested but never cracked. I'm not a performance. I'm not a costume tailored to make you comfortable. Her words didn't come fast. They came exact. I'm the sum of all of those truths at once, she continued, her tone intensifying with each beat. Every room I walk into, I carry all of it with me, and none of it needs to be softened to be real. She wasn't just defending herself, she was defining herself without apology, without compromise. The world often demanded black women slice off parts of their identity to be palatable. Jasmine wasn't offering them that convenience. She was standing whole, unfiltered, and unafraid. In that moment, she became something more than a guest on a show. She became a mirror for everything the media had trained itself not to see. The camera cut to Megan just half a second too late to mask the shift in her expression. Her brow tensed, her lips parted, but not to speak. It was the look of someone who had spent years mastering the art of control, now unsure if the ground beneath her was still stable. Her practiced media composure, so often her shield, faltered in the face of something raw, human, and irrefutable. She had come prepared to expose Jasmine, but instead the audience watched her get revealed. Not as a journalist, not as a neutral moderator, but as someone standing uncomfortably in the presence of truth that couldn't be reduced, redirected, or dismissed. And Jasmine? She didn't gloat. She didn't lean back in triumph. She sat steady, breathing evenly, as if everything that just happened was inevitable. Because to her, it was. The atmosphere in the studio had shifted again. Subtle at first, like the moment a storm changes direction. Jasmine's presence had already fractured the frame Megan tried to place around her, but now she was reaching deeper, past the surface, past policy, past personal attack, into something older, something sacred. And it started not with a fact, not with a stat, but with an image. She moved slowly, intentionally, as if aware that what she was about to reveal did not belong to the world, but needed to be seen by it. From the same folder that had held law reviews and congressional reports, Jasmine pulled out a small, creased photograph. The color had begun to fade at the corners, but the power of the woman captured in it had not. She didn't hold it up with flourish. She simply placed it on the table between them, gently, like one might set down a candle in a dark room. Her fingers lingered at the edge for half a second longer than necessary, tracing the frame not to show affection, but to steady herself. It was the only thing in the studio not filtered through makeup, scripting, or lighting. It was real, and so was the history behind it. This, Jasmine said, her voice resonant but low, is my mother, a nurse, a civil rights marcher, a woman who was once refused service at a diner because her skin made someone else uncomfortable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth was already doing the work. The camera lens narrowed its focus instinctively, trying to capture the slight quiver in Jasmine's lip, the fire in her gaze, the weight in her words. The stillness in the studio wasn't respectful. It was transfixed. Even Megan, seasoned and prepared, felt the gravity shift. Because this wasn't just rebuttal, it was memory with muscle, testimony wrapped in bloodline. When you say you don't see color, Jasmine continued, her eyes locked directly on Megan now, you're not making a statement about equality. You're erasing her. The words hit hard, not like punches, but like truth dropping into a hollow space that had never held it before. Jasmine didn't flinch. She leaned slightly forward, just enough to press into the moment, not to intimidate, but to ensure there was no escape from what she was saying. You're saying her struggle, her dignity, her scars, none of it matters because you choose not to look. There was no malice in her tone, only exhaustion and precision. It was the exhaustion of generations distilled into a single moment, of being asked to explain, to educate, to endure, all while being judged for how gracefully you perform it. The audience watching from their screens might not have known her mother. They might not have lived that refusal at the diner. But in Jasmine's voice, they could feel its echo, unmistakable, heavy, and unforgiven. She placed the photo flat on the table, her hand hovering above it for just a second, not out of sentimentality, but reverence. You don't get to ignore color and still claim to understand the pain it carries, she said, steady now. My mother didn't need to be made comfortable. She needed to be seen. That last line cut deeper than any headline. It wasn't poetic, it was factual, and brutal in its honesty. The kind of honesty that demanded not just listening, but reckoning. Her gaze softened, but her resolve hardened. She didn't look away from Megan, not even for a blink. She used to tell me, never let them make you invisible. Jasmine's voice thinned slightly, not from fear, but from the ache of remembering something so fiercely intimate on a stage so brutally public. Not in school, not in court, not in rooms like this. The irony hung in the air like static. She was quoting a woman made invisible by history, by racism, by systems designed to silence, and doing so in front of a woman who embodied that system's power. She told me that if the world won't give you space, you carve it anyway, and you bring others with you. There it was, the line that wasn't rehearsed, that couldn't have been, because it came from somewhere beneath theory and rhetoric. It came from bone. It came from watching your mother walk out of rooms where she wasn't welcome, only to show up again the next day. It came from knowing that the smile she wore in that photo wasn't joy, it was resistance. And Jasmine had carried it forward, not out of obligation, but out of gratitude, out of survival. The studio was still, but not empty. Something had been broken open, and not by anger, not by force, but by a daughter's truth. Jasmine didn't sit back in triumph. She didn't gloat or wait for applause. She simply returned her hand to the photograph and rested her fingers on the edge of the frame. She didn't need to say anything else. The weight of what she'd said had already filled every inch of that room, every square of the screen, every space between the audience's breath. And across the nation, people weren't just watching anymore. They were remembering their own mothers, their own grandmothers, the stories buried beneath politeness and policy, and realizing maybe for the first time that seeing color isn't the problem, refusing to see it is. The photo still rested between them like a quiet act of defiance, but Megyn Kelly didn't look at it. She couldn't. Instead, she cleared her throat and shifted in her seat, reaching, almost instinctively, for control. Her voice returned, tight and forced, carrying none of the command it had just minutes earlier. Well, with all due respect, she said, trying to steady herself behind a smile that barely held together, we also have to acknowledge the very real issue of crime in Black communities. The pivot was abrupt. It wasn't subtle, and it wasn't innocent. It was a move pulled straight from an old playbook. When confronted with a personal truth too deep to deny, change the subject. Shift the lens. Reframe the Black experience as pathology. And Jasmine, of course, had seen it before. Many times. But this time, it wasn't just her who saw it. Outside the studio, across laptops, phones, tablets, and living room screens, The live stream feed didn't just react, it exploded. The chat box began to pulse like a living organism, words cascading faster than the software could buffer. Let her speak. Colorblind is cowardice. Megan, this is embarrassing. What had begun as a one-on-one exchange was now a national referendum on who got to speak truth and who got to run from it. The viewers weren't detached. They weren't merely watching. They were responding with fury, frustration, clarity. Some typed in all caps. Some wrote one word. But the message was unified. This wasn't journalism. It was deflection. It was erasure. Live on air. In the control room, the staff exchanged frantic looks. One producer whispered, "The comment thread is out of control." Another voice muttered into a headset, "The algorithm's already flipping the headline. We're losing this." But inside the studio, Jasmine didn't speak. Not yet. She didn't interrupt Megan's scramble. She didn't rescue her from the silence swallowing her spin. Because Jasmine understood something Megan didn't. The most powerful moment wasn't the one where she delivered a perfect line. It was the moment when people, real people, began to echo it back without being told. The stream kept flooding. Viewers who had never commented before found themselves typing. One said, "She brought her mother into this, and you brought stats about crime? Shame on you." Another wrote simply, "We see what you're doing." The veneer cracked further with every passing second. The more Megan spoke, the more she buried herself in a narrative that no longer held power. Her words kept coming, but they bounced off a wall of rising public awareness. And Jasmine, calm and still, let it all unfold. Because truth once spoken doesn't ask permission to echo. It simply does. The quiet after the confrontation had a sharpness to it. It wasn't calm, it was a vacuum. The kind of silence that falls after something irreversible has been said. Jasmine's last words about her mother, about being seen, had torn through the stage like a fault line cracking beneath polished floors. And Megan, sensing the ground shift beneath her, did what many in power do when cornered by truth. She tried to reframe the pain. Her posture stiffened, the muscles around her mouth tightened, and her tone, no longer curated, hardened into something defensive. Not calculated, not composed, just exposed. She blinked rapidly, her voice no longer belonging to the seasoned anchor, but to the wounded ego behind it. "So what now?" she said suddenly, breaking the charged stillness. Her voice pitched slightly higher, the tremor unmistakable. "If I was born white, is that my fault?" The words didn't echo, they thudded, loud, clumsy, unrefined, like a stone thrown in a room full of glass. Her face flushed, not with anger, but with the panic of someone who's lost control of the story they thought they were telling. It wasn't a question born of curiosity. It wasn't an honest inquiry. It was a defense mechanism, one that's been passed down through generations of privilege. A last resort plea to redirect attention from systemic accountability to personal absolution. And she said it out loud, on air, in front of millions. For a split second, no one moved. A production assistant behind the camera dropped a pen. The sound felt amplified. The control room froze. Viewers around the country leaned forward, not to catch the next punch, but to see how Jasmine would respond. This was a test, not of intellect, not of preparation, but of grace under pressure, of clarity in the face of emotional bait. And Jasmine, unflinching, steady, worn from years of having her pain redirected, did not meet panic with panic. She didn't sigh. She didn't scoff. She simply turned her head toward Megan, her expression firm but not cruel, composed but far from passive. Jasmine had seen this tactic too many times before. When pain made people uncomfortable, they'd shift the burden to the person holding it. It was classic, and it was exhausting, but she had no need to be dramatic. She didn't need volume. She only needed truth. "The problem isn't that you were born white," Jasmine said, each word landing with the weight of lived experience. "The problem is that you use it as an excuse not to see someone else's pain." There was no anger in her tone, just precision, like a surgeon's scalpel, not meant to wound, but to expose what's been hidden under the skin too long. Jasmine wasn't accusing Megan of whiteness. She was indicting the way it had been wielded. not as identity, but as a shield against empathy. That sentence alone cracked the scaffolding Megan had built around herself, not just during the interview, but for years on camera. The posture of objectivity, the mask of neutrality, the carefully constructed image of the rational voice in a chaotic world. Jasmine wasn't just speaking to Megan. She was speaking to the culture that allowed that performance to flourish unchallenged. Megan didn't answer. Couldn't. Her mouth opened slightly, but nothing came. The cameras zoomed in without instruction. The producers, seasoned and typically relentless, let it ride. Because they knew something had just happened. Not a meltdown. Not a viral gotcha. Something deeper. Something quieter. A power shift that didn't come from volume or spectacle, but from someone refusing to soften the truth for broadcast. The air in the studio became dense. Not heavy. Dense. As if something invisible had settled over everyone and refused to leave. The kind of weight that forces people to stop pretending. The crew behind the scenes barely blinked. A boom mic operator swallowed hard, unsure whether to adjust the levels or just listen. Even the lights seemed dimmer, though they hadn't moved an inch. The studio had become a courtroom and Jasmine's sentence had hung like a gavel. Final, undeniable, and echoing. But perhaps what made the moment most powerful was what didn't follow. Jasmine didn't go for the knockout. She didn't use the silence as a stage to preach or provoke. She just held it. Trusted it. Let it stretch long enough for Megan, and every viewer who had ever asked that same question, to sit in it. To feel what it meant to be confronted not with blame, but with the discomfort of having run from another person's pain for so long that they forgot what it felt like to acknowledge it. This was no longer a segment on identity politics. It had become something sacred, not scripted, not spun, just raw human reckoning, televised live and impossible to edit. And Megan, for the first time in her career, after countless interviews, moderated debates, and viral sparring matches, she had no words. Nothing left to grab, nothing left to pivot to. Because in that moment, even she knew, any attempt to speak would only deepen the silence Jasmine had already filled with something far more lasting than outrage. She said nothing, and the silence roared. The silence in the studio was the kind that didn't end when the camera stopped rolling. It traveled. It bled through cables, bounced off satellites, and spilled into the digital bloodstream of a nation too divided to agree on much, yet suddenly united in the certainty that something seismic had just unfolded. Within minutes of the episode's abrupt ending, clips began to surface. First, it was one viewer on Twitter posting the now infamous exchange. Jasmine's calm retort, Megan's wide-eyed pause, the haunting stillness that followed. Then came the others. TikTok feeds lit up with side-by-side commentary. Young activists, elderly pastors, law students, even high schoolers reacting. Mouths agape, nodding slowly, saying what no broadcast anchor dared. This is the shift. The clips weren't edited for drama. They didn't need to be. The raw footage was enough. Jasmine sitting upright, composed. Her voice low, steady, surgical. The problem isn't that you were born white. The problem is that you use it as an excuse not to see someone else's pain. That sentence became the moment that crossed platforms and generations. Hashtags formed instantly. See the pain. Truth did the shouting. Colorblind no more. On YouTube, the full segment uploaded by a third party hit 1 million views in under 4 hours. Commenters called it the most important 5 minutes of TV this year. A quiet revolution had taken place, not in protest or upheaval, but in clarity, in dignity, in words spoken without venom, yet impossible to silence. Newsrooms scrambled to catch up. By morning, headlines had overtaken every major site, some stunned, some snide, but all acknowledging the moment's reach. The Washington Post led with, Jasmine Crockett didn't shout, but the truth did. The subheader read, a 7-word reply dismantled a decade-old media defense. The Atlantic followed. Colorblind is the new excuse. Crockett unmasks the lie. On the cover of Time's digital edition, Jasmine's still image sat front and center, unapologetic, unshaken, with one line underneath, Seen. Editorial boards, once hesitant to engage in racial discourse, now had no choice. Opinion columns debated whether Kelly had walked into the ambush or revealed her own script. But the viewers already knew. This wasn't a trap. It was a mirror. And what the country saw in that mirror, especially white Americans, was uncomfortable. Because it wasn't rage that had cornered them, or moral superiority. It was measured truth. Calm, unflinching, undeniable. That made it harder to dismiss. It wasn't passion that shattered the silence. It was precision. And Jasmine, through a single line delivered without raising her voice, had exposed what countless loud protests and thousands of ignored reports could not. That the real threat to false narratives is quiet, disciplined truth spoken directly into the void. Institutions reacted next. At Howard University in Georgia, the Black Student Union moved fast, announcing a public symposium within 48 hours. Its title was simple: The Colorblind Fallacy, When Not Seeing Means Not Caring. Panelists included civil rights historians, behavioral psychologists, and community organizers. But the keynote belonged to a woman who had once marched beside Jasmine's mother in Dallas back in 1966, and now stood before a new generation to say, "I've been waiting 50 years to hear a politician say what she said last night." The room overflowed. Students sat on stairs, leaned against walls, listening to each other unpack what colorblind had stolen from them: identity, visibility, truth. On TikTok, young creators began dissecting the layers. The manipulation behind Megan's pivot to crime, the use of emotional misdirection to recenter whiteness, the way silence had been weaponized against Jasmine until she reclaimed it on her terms. One 17-year-old from Oakland posted a clip titled, "Why Jasmine Didn't Yell and Why It Changed Everything." It garnered 3 million views in a day. Another, a biracial journalist from Chicago, broke down how Black women are expected to either perform pain or mute themselves, and how Jasmine rejected both. Even those outside political spaces responded. In coffee shops, barber chairs, Sunday services, boardrooms, people weren't quoting political figures. They were quoting Jasmine, word for word. The problem isn't that "you were born white" became a line repeated not with malice, but reflection. A line that forced people to consider how often they had used neutrality as a shield, good intentions as a crutch, and discomfort as an excuse to disengage. The nation didn't erupt. It paused. And for the first time in a long time, that pause didn't feel like apathy. It felt like listening. Meanwhile, Jasmine remained silent. No press tours, no morning show appearances, no victory lap. Just a single pinned tweet that read, "I wasn't trying to make headlines. I was trying to be heard. The fact that so many finally listened says more about this country than it does about me." The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Jasmine Crockett hadn't shouted, but somehow the world was louder now. And Megyn Kelly, whose voice had once dominated primetime and sculpted narratives, had been reduced to a footnote in the very story she tried to control. The narrative had slipped from her fingers, not because someone yelled, but because someone finally refused to be silenced. And the world, watching with their thumbs and screens, decided to echo that refusal, again and again, in millions of voices. As the echo of her words continued to ripple through screens and headlines across the nation, Jasmine Crockett withdrew from the noise, not as an act of avoidance, but of survival. The day had been a storm of precision, silence, fire, and restraint. She had stood alone beneath the hot breath of stage lights, facing a woman who had weaponized civility to deflect truth, and she'd done it without ever once raising her voice. The moment was historic, yes, but it had also been deeply personal, raw in ways no article or camera could fully capture. She had exposed something so intimate: her mother's photo, her own childhood, the inherited pain stitched into her calm, and now, alone in the dark, she sat with the toll that truth takes when the cameras go off and the crowd doesn't follow. Her car was parked near the edge of her block, beneath a swaying street lamp that flickered like it, too, had spent the day battling exhaustion. The windows were fogging slightly from the warmth of her breath, her coat still on, engine off, and her hands resting idly in her lap. She hadn't turned on the radio. The silence was earned. It was the first time in 24 hours that no one was speaking at her, or about her, or around her. She didn't crave the validation, not in the way people assumed. What she craved was space, the kind where she could feel everything she'd spent the day controlling. And then, just as she allowed her body to begin settling into that silence, her phone buzzed softly in her coat pocket. A single vibration, one message. She pulled it out slowly, not expecting anything she hadn't already seen. The usual flood of emails, mentions, a few anonymous threats, a few empty praises. But what appeared on her screen was something else entirely. No profile picture, no name, just text, direct and clean. I'm the daughter of a conservative cop. Today I understood your mother. Thank you for not giving up. 3 lines. No embellishment, no likes, no digital applause. Just truth, from a stranger. Jasmine read it once, then again. The simplicity made it heavier, not lighter. She felt the breath catch in her throat, not because she was shocked, but because this was the thing that always crept up quietly after the wars. The grief for what it cost to reach one person. That woman's father would never know his daughter had crossed an invisible line that night, not out of rebellion, but out of recognition. Jasmine hadn't met her. She hadn't spoken to her, but she had reached her. And somehow that was more overwhelming than all the noise. The tears came not all at once, but in slow, quiet succession, beginning at the edges of her eyes and sliding down the curves of her face like warm fingerprints left by something sacred. She didn't wipe them away. She didn't clench her jaw or pretend to hold it in. She let them fall. Because this wasn't sorrow. It wasn't even relief. It was hope. The most dangerous and exhausting thing to carry in a world that insists on proving it wrong. The kind of hope you earn after being told you are too loud, too black, too ambitious, too difficult, too much, and refusing to shrink in response. She placed the phone face down on the passenger seat and rested both hands on the steering wheel, as if trying to steady herself against a storm that had already passed but still left the air charged. The city moved quietly around her. A dog barked a few blocks away. A siren wailed distantly, muted by brick and night in the hum of late traffic. But inside the car, time had slowed to a crawl. Jasmine let her head fall gently against the headrest, eyes closed, breath shallow. The pressure behind her eyes was thick, and the ache in her chest, sore from carrying so much restraint for so long, had finally loosened its grip. Not because justice had arrived, but because someone had seen her mother. That woman, that uniformed warrior in a nurse's coat, that woman who had been denied a booth at a diner in Texas but never once denied her daughter the truth of her own worth. That woman whose photo Jasmine had placed on a cold studio table as armor, not decoration. Tonight, for perhaps the first time in decades, someone who'd grown up in a house that likely defended that same diner now understood her. That mattered. It shouldn't have had to, but it did, because it meant the silence Jasmine shattered on that stage hadn't been for nothing. It had gone somewhere. It had made contact. Her mother's voice whispered back to her like muscle memory, "Never let them make you invisible." That voice had carried Jasmine through law school, through courtrooms, through Congress, and now through a moment that felt more like a fault line than a victory. She hadn't shouted. She hadn't cursed. She hadn't pointed a finger. And still, the truth had reverberated. That truth had spoken louder than shouting because it refused to retreat. In that moment, she didn't feel like a politician or a pundit or a viral voice. She felt like a daughter sitting in a car in the middle of the night, crying quietly because someone, somewhere, had listened. Not to win an argument, not to draft a bill, but to feel something they'd spent a lifetime ignoring. She didn't know the woman's name. She didn't need to. That wasn't the point. The point was that it had reached her, and that meant it could reach others. The clock on the dashboard glowed 12:03 a.m. Jasmine didn't start the car. She didn't need to go anywhere just yet. She stayed there in the stillness, letting her body breathe without armor. And for the first time that day, maybe the first time in weeks, she felt light enough to exhale without bracing for the next blow. The message was still on the screen. She let it sit there, a digital thread between two strangers who would likely never meet, but who were connected now by something larger than debate. Hope doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come with banners or ballots. Sometimes it's just 3 lines in the middle of the night. Sometimes it's the reason you keep speaking, even when your voice shakes, even when they try to silence you, because somewhere, someone is listening. And tonight, Jasmine Crockett knew that was enough. The memory of the anonymous message in her car, the one that made her cry not out of defeat, but out of hope, had anchored something inside Jasmine that no headline, no clip, no spotlight ever could. A quiet conviction had taken root. And 1 week later, when she stepped onto the grand stage of the National Policy and Ethics Summit, that conviction came with her. The venue was cavernous, filled wall to wall with scholars, politicians, journalists, students, and veterans of every civil rights generation. They had gathered expecting insight, perhaps even controversy. What they did not expect was grace forged from fire. And Jasmine, standing alone at the center of that vast hall, knew this was not just a moment. It was the weight of many moments converging into one. She stood still before speaking. No teleprompter, no prepared talking points, just a single piece of paper folded into the inside pocket of her jacket and the photo of her mother in her left hand. She adjusted the mic. The hush in the room was complete. The air was heavy with anticipation. "I've been told," she began, her voice quiet but resolute, "that I speak too plainly, that I'm too direct, too firm, too unwilling to bend my voice to soothe people who never had to bend theirs." She paused, letting the weight of the words settle. "But what I am," she said, eyes sweeping the crowd, "is tired." There was no tremble in her voice, only the unmistakable steadiness of a woman who had learned to wield silence as power. Tired of being told that dignity sounds aggressive, that truth sounds angry, that speaking from the depth of your wound means you're unfit to lead. Her cadence was slow, deliberate. "I'm not here to demand sympathy. I'm here to dismantle a myth. That neutrality is noble. That not seeing color is justice. That pretending pain isn't racial makes you fair." She stepped slightly forward. The audience leaned in. Jasmine's hand lifted the photo of her mother with reverence, like a lit candle. "This," she said, "is my mother." Her name was Ruth Elaine Crockett. She was a nurse, a daughter of sharecroppers, a woman who was told more than once that her skin made her unworthy of rest, of dignity, of being served at a diner. Jasmine's voice dropped to a near whisper. But she never stopped serving others. Never stopped believing I could walk into rooms she wasn't allowed to enter. Never stopped telling me, "Don't let them make you invisible." She drew a breath, not to recover, but to sharpen. Her spine straightened. "So let me say this clearly, for everyone listening. I don't need you to see my color. I need you to stop using color blindness as an excuse to ignore the pain that color has cost me." It didn't erupt. The room didn't cheer. It didn't need to. The line landed like thunder that rolls silently across the horizon, felt in the chest before it's heard. A professor from Princeton leaned back in her chair, hand over her mouth. A student from New Orleans wiped her eyes. A conservative lawmaker who had planned to leave early stayed seated, hands folded, jaw tense. Jasmine had not attacked. She had not blamed. She had only named the thing too many had been afraid to name. The myth that not acknowledging race was somehow moral, that ignorance could pass for peace, and she'd shattered it without ever raising her voice. Later, that sentence would be printed in bold font across the newly revised modern movements in American politics, taught in lectures and debated in seminars. But on that night, it wasn't ink on a page. It was breath in the room. It was Jasmine, flesh and blood, standing in the full inheritance of struggle and clarity, saying what generations of women had said in whispers, behind closed doors, in diaries and prayers and kitchen table conversations. "See me, all of me. Not because I ask you to, but because you can't fix what you refuse to face." She closed her address not with a flourish, but with a return. She looked down once more at her mother's photo, then gently folded it, placing it back into the breast pocket over her heart. "She's with me," Jasmine said. "Every step, every sentence." Her voice, though soft, rang clear across the rafters. "She told me to never shrink, to never dim, and I never have. even when I was told to make my voice softer, my tone smoother, my truth more convenient. She glanced toward the rear of the hall, where the light began to fade into shadow. I've done my part. Now it's time for this country to do its. She stepped back from the microphone. The lights dimmed slightly as she turned away from the podium. No anthem played. No host rushed in with a closing line. The silence was intentional, respectful, reverent, almost holy. Jasmine descended the steps slowly, her shoulders still square, her hands calm at her sides. The photo of her mother now peeked slightly from her pocket, as if the light itself had drawn it forward. And as she reached the edge of the stage, the spotlight shifted, not toward her face, but behind her, casting a long, soft shadow on the wall behind. It was there, in that moment, that a stillness fell over the room more profound than any applause. Jasmine Crockett, once ridiculed for being too much, too visible, too uncompromising, now walked off a national stage carrying her mother's memory like a second heartbeat. The glow behind her stretched long and warm, wrapping the back of her silhouette in soft gold. It wasn't stage light. It wasn't trickery. It looked like presence. And for those watching, whether in that hall, online, or years later in classrooms reading about it, they would remember the image not because of what Jasmine said, but because of what she carried. A voice, yes. A legacy, certainly. But more than that, a reminder that behind every woman who dares to speak plainly, to name injustice, to walk into rooms she was never invited into, there's another woman watching from the shadows of memory, whispering, "Keep going." And Jasmine did. The image of Jasmine descending from the stage, her mother's photo catching the light as if it too was bearing witness, would remain etched in the minds of those who were there, and those who would later learn about it. But that moment wasn't just symbolic. It was the final punctuation on a sentence America had been afraid to finish. A sentence about truth, about race, about the responsibility not to be passive in the presence of pain. And as the light faded and the hall emptied into whispers and footsteps, one question lingered in the air, urgent and quietly electric. What now? The answer wasn't in policy. It wasn't even in protest. It was in something harder, quieter, but more revolutionary than either. Empathy backed by action. And that is where the human lesson began to take root. The human lesson in Jasmine Crockett's story isn't just that injustice exists. It's that injustice adapts. It dresses itself in new language, hides beneath civility, and calls itself fairness while asking others to contort their identities for comfort. Jasmine wasn't fighting an overt bigot. She was confronting a polished denial, a soft-shoed form of erasure wrapped in media language and cultural power. What she exposed wasn't just ignorance, but the deep reluctance to acknowledge pain that doesn't belong to us. And that is the true danger of so-called color blindness. It is not a position of equality. It is a refusal of accountability. It allows people to pat themselves on the back for being good while stepping over the very people who cry out to be seen. What Jasmine reminded the world is that being seen, fully seen, is not a luxury. It is not a reward. It is a right. And it is one that many still have to fight for, every day, in boardrooms, classrooms, courtrooms, and yes, even on television sets where truth is supposed to be sacred. The injustice she faced wasn't just in the question posed to her. It was in the implication behind it, that her voice must be a performance, that her tone must be a strategy, that her very identity was too complex, too unpalatable, too raw to be real. And in response, she didn't raise her voice. She raised the standard. She reminded us all that humanity is not proven by how well we endure pain, but by how boldly we name it. The lesson here is also about restraint. Jasmine didn't humiliate. She didn't retaliate. She didn't weaponize the moment for social clout or public revenge. She simply told the truth and allowed that truth to land exactly where it needed to. Her power didn't come from dominating the conversation. It came from refusing to be reduced within it. And in doing so, she flipped the script on what strength looks like. It's not always volume. Sometimes it's precision. Sometimes it's a woman holding up a photograph of her mother on live television and daring the world to erase her again. But perhaps the most human and haunting part of Jasmine's journey is that she didn't expect change to come overnight. She didn't expect her truth to move mountains. What she hoped, what she believed, was that it could move a single heart. And it did. That one message in her car, from the daughter of a conservative cop, carried more weight than 1,000 retweets. Because it proved that someone had listened, that someone had laid down their defenses for just long enough to let truth in. And that is where every human revolution begins. Not with crowds, but with a crack. A small break in the wall we build to protect our comfort at the expense of someone else's reality. And if that's true, if even one person can be changed by one moment of courage, then everything Jasmine did was not only necessary, but noble. The legacy she carried was not just her mother's. It belonged to every person who had ever been told their voice was too sharp, too loud, too inconvenient. It belonged to every child who watched their parent be disrespected in silence. To every young woman of color told to tone it down to fit in. Jasmine didn't tone it down. She tuned it to the frequency of truth. And that truth reverberated across a country that claims to value freedom, but so often fears the people who demand it fully. So what's the lesson? It's this: that change doesn't always look like policy. It often looks like discomfort. That justice is not a debate to be won, but a story to be told until the telling itself becomes impossible to ignore. That empathy without proximity is just theory, and Jasmine made that theory bleed. She brought her mother into the room. She brought generations into that conversation. And by doing so, she didn't just speak for herself, she amplified the silence of thousands. The world may forget headlines, it may scroll past clips, but it will not forget the image of a woman standing still, holding a photo, and refusing to let her story be edited for public ease. It will not forget the courage to say, "See me," not for your comfort, but for my survival. That is the human lesson. That is the beating heart beneath every moment Jasmine endured. And that is why, long after the cameras turned off, her voice still rings. Not because it shouted, but because it refused to go silent. The quiet power of Jasmine Crockett's story doesn't live in a headline. It doesn't end with applause. It lingers in the space between her voice and your reaction. It lingers in the tension it awakens inside the viewer. The tension between who we are and who we claim to be. If you watched her sit across from a media titan, refusing to flinch, refusing to scream, and still managing to make millions hear her, then you know this was more than just television. It was confrontation with comfort, a reckoning with everything we've been taught to politely ignore. And now that you've seen it, now that you know, the burden has shifted. Because witnessing truth without action is complicity, dressed in softer language. The camera may have captured Jasmine, but the lesson isn't about her alone. It's about us. It's about what happens when we're given a mirror and asked if we're brave enough to actually look. When Jasmine said, "The problem isn't that you were born white. The problem is that you use it as an excuse not to see someone else's pain," she wasn't weaponizing identity. She was naming avoidance. And in doing so, she pierced through a culture that too often swaps responsibility for rhetoric. That moment was not meant to end when the lights went down or when the live stream stopped. That moment was an ignition point, and now it burns in our hands. What we do with it will determine whether we are changed or just entertained. So here it is, the call to action. Not the kind that asks you to post or share or nod along in private. The kind that demands discomfort, that asks you to speak up when it's awkward, that insists you show up when no one else will. Start at home. Start at your workplace. Start in your place of worship, your classroom, your boardroom, your backyard. Find the spaces where neutrality has been used as a shield and tear it down. Jasmine didn't expose an individual flaw. She exposed a pattern of erasure that survives not through violence alone, but through silence, through "I didn't know," through "I didn't mean to," through "that's not my fight." Make it your fight. You don't need a podium. You don't need a broadcast. You need a spine. You need to be the one in the meeting who says, "That comment wasn't okay." The one in the hiring process who asks, "Why don't our candidates look like the people we serve?" The one who notices who gets interrupted, who gets passed over, who gets talked over, and says something. You need to be the voice that doesn't need a trending hashtag to know what is right. Jasmine spoke for her mother, for herself, and for everyone who's ever had to code switch just to survive. Now you must speak for those who still can't. And don't mistake this for a performance. This isn't activism as aesthetic. This is about infrastructure, building equity into the very bones of our institutions. It's about demanding that schools stop teaching sanitized history, that cities audit the racial bias in their policing, that funding no longer flow to places that filter diversity through PR departments. It's about rewriting the rules, not rewriting the slogans. This will not be easy. It will not be applauded. It will not be met with thank you cards. But Jasmine didn't ask for gratitude. She asked for honesty. She asked for vision. She asked for us to stop excusing our ignorance as innocence. And if you're exhausted, good. That means you're beginning to understand. Because Jasmine's strength wasn't born from inspiration. It was born from endurance, from hearing her voice questioned, her background picked apart, her tone dissected, her loyalty to truth treated as a threat. And yet she showed up, fully, unfiltered, with a photo of her mother in one hand and centuries of dismissal pressing down on the other. If she can hold that weight and still speak, you can hold a little discomfort and still act. It's time to shift from empathy to equity, from conversation to confrontation, from observation to obligation. If you watched that interview, nodded and moved on, you missed the point. But if you felt something rise in you, something uneasy and insistent, then lean into it. That is your conscience waking up. Don't lull it back to sleep with hashtags and hopeful language. Fuel it, feed it. Let it drag you into the uncomfortable rooms, because that's where change begins. Not with courage that feels good, but with courage that costs something. We are past the age of raising awareness. We are in the era of raising standards. Jasmine raised the standard that night, not with anger, but with accountability. Not with blame, but with truth. And now the bar has been moved. You can't lower it again. You can't pretend you didn't hear her. You can't pretend her words didn't stir something. So stop waiting for someone else to go first. Be the first. Be the next. Be the one who refuses to pass this story down to the next generation untouched. History doesn't remember who stayed neutral. It remembers who stood up when the room asked them to sit down. It remembers who told the truth when it was most inconvenient. If you are reading this, you have a choice, to be moved or to move. Jasmine Crockett did not break the silence so we could sit quietly in awe. She broke it so we would rise in its wake. So now rise. The time for watching is over. The time for acting has come. And if you're wondering where to begin, start with the smallest defiance. Speak the truth in the rooms that reward silence. Challenge the jokes that pretend to be harmless. Call out the policies dressed up as tradition, but built on exclusion. Look around your workplace, your schools, your city council, and ask the uncomfortable questions. Who isn't here? Who isn't safe? Who isn't heard? Then stay long enough to hear the answer. Don't rush to defend your intent. Listen to the impact. Because the real work isn't about appearing informed, it's about becoming responsible. Jasmine Crockett didn't go viral because she shouted. She went viral because she didn't flinch when truth got heavy, because she stood still while the room tried to shift around her. That's your blueprint. You don't have to be her, but you can carry a piece of her courage into the next conversation you're tempted to avoid, into the next meeting where equity becomes a side note, into the next dinner table debate where someone says, "I just don't see color," and you decide finally to say, "Then you're not seeing me." Change won't feel dramatic. It will feel awkward, uncomfortable, lonely at times, but it will be real. And it will ripple, just like Jasmine's words did, into classrooms, into boardrooms, into hearts, into the daughter of a conservative cop who had no reason to listen until she did. That's what truth can do. Not all at once, not for everyone, but enough. Enough to turn a moment into movement. Enough to turn your silence into someone else's voice. So start where you are. Use what you have. Speak even when your voice shakes. And if ever you doubt whether it's worth it, remember Jasmine. Calm, composed, standing alone with a photo in her hand and fire in her chest. She didn't shout, but her truth did. Now let yours. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.